Snow whipped through the pines, burying any hope of survival under 3 feet of frost. A desperate man, stripped of his home and dignity just days before Christmas, stumbled toward a ruined silhouette in the trees. What waited inside that rotting cabin wouldn't just save his life. It would rewrite history. Theodore Barnes did not plan to freeze to death on the 19th of December. Just 3 months prior, the 42-year-old had been a respected senior coordinator at Crescent Valley Freight in Missoula, Montana. But life, Theodore had learned, possessed a brutal sense of irony. After discovering a series of glaring discrepancies in the company's international shipping manifests, he had brought his concerns to his manager, Leonard Crowley. 2 days later, Theodore was abruptly terminated for chronic insubordination. Stripped of his income, already drowning in residual medical debt from his late wife's battle with cancer, the financial freefall had been swift and merciless. His landlord, a notoriously unsympathetic man named Mr. Henderson, had finalized the eviction on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Theodore had packed his remaining life into the bed of a rusted 1998 Ford Ranger and pointed his tires toward the Bitterroot Mountains. His cousin, Samuel Hayes, managed a sprawling commercial tree farm near the Idaho border and had promised Theodore a seasonal job and a warm cot in the foreman's trailer. It was a lifeline. It was a chance to rebuild. But the Ranger's transmission finally gave out on an isolated stretch of Highway 12, grinding to a violent halt amidst a labyrinth of towering, snow-dusted pines. With no cellular service and the temperature plummeting to a lethal 0 degrees Fahrenheit, Theodore made the only choice he could. He zipped up his fraying canvas coat, pulled his woolen hat low over his ears, and began to walk. He hoped to find a ranger station or a logging outpost, but within 30 minutes, the sky bruised into a deep, aggressive violet. The wind began to howl, no longer a breeze, but a physical force, driving jagged shards of ice into his cheeks. The blizzard struck with apocalyptic suddenness. Whiteout conditions erased the highway, the tree line, and his sense of direction, the anatomy of desperation. As the hours dragged on, the cold stopped feeling like an external element and became something alive, burrowing into his bones. The progression of freezing to death is deceptively peaceful in its final stages, and Theodore was terrifyingly aware of his own failing biology. First hour. His fingers and toes transitioned from burning agony to complete, terrifying numbness. Second hour. Uncontrollable, violent shivering overtook his core, burning through the meager calories he had left. Third hour. A profound, heavy lethargy settled over his mind. The snowbanks began to look incredibly soft, like down pillows inviting him to just close his eyes for a minute. He was stumbling blindly, veering far off the asphalt and into the dense, untamed wilderness of the Lolo National Forest. Every step required a monumental effort of will. He dragged his heavy boots through snowdrifts that reached his knees, his breath forming frozen clouds that instantly crystallized on his beard. Just as his knees buckled and he prepared to surrender to the endless white expanse, a geometric anomaly broke the chaotic pattern of the forest. It was barely a shadow through the driving snow, a sharp, unnatural angle among the sloping pines. Theodore forced himself upward, fueled by a final, primal surge of adrenaline. As he pushed through a thicket of frozen rhododendrons, the structure revealed itself. It was a cabin. Decades of neglect had practically camouflaged it into the landscape. The roof sagged under a heavy blanket of snow. The timber walls were blackened by rot, and the single visible window was boarded shut with thick planks of pine. It looked as though no one had stepped foot near it since the Reagan administration. Theodore dragged himself onto the rotting porch. His clumsy, frost-bitten hands fumbled with the iron latch. It was frozen solid. Panic, sharp and suffocating, flared in his chest. He threw his shoulder against the heavy oak door. Once. Twice. On the third impact, the rusted hinges screamed in protest, the latch snapped, and Theodore tumbled forward into absolute darkness into a night in the tomb. He quickly shoved the door shut behind him, cutting off the deafening roar of the blizzard. The silence inside was immediate and heavy. The air was frigid, yet free from the wind's lethal bite. It smelled of dry rot, ancient pine needles, and the distinct, dusty odor of abandonment. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, pale light filtering through the cracks in the boards revealed a single room. It was stark and utilitarian. A ruined mattress lay on an iron frame in the corner. A heavy oak table sat in the center. And most importantly, a pot-belly cast-iron stove stood against the far wall. Theodore wasted no time. Moving with desperate, jerky motions, he began breaking apart a brittle wooden chair he found near the table. He stuffed the dry splinters into the stove, adding handfuls of old, brittle newspapers he found stacked in a milk crate. His fingers were so numb, he ruined 4 matches before finally striking a flame. When the fire caught, the dry wood ignited with a cheerful crackle. Theodore collapsed onto the dusty floor in front of the stove, pressing his shivering body as close to the warming iron as he dared. As the radiant heat began to thaw his extremities, sending waves of agonizing pins and needles through his flesh, he wrapped himself in a moth-eaten canvas tarp he pulled from the bed. He was homeless. He was stranded. He was entirely alone, just days before Christmas. But as the fire painted dancing orange shadows against the decaying walls, Theodore Barnes closed his eyes and wept a single tear of gratitude. He was alive. When Theodore woke, the fire had reduced to a bed of glowing red embers, and brilliant, piercing sunlight was slicing through the gaps in the window boards. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a silent, frozen world. His stomach twisted with a hollow ache, and his throat was parched. He scooped clean snow from the porch, melting it in a rusted tin cup over the remaining coals. As he drank the metallic-tasting water, his mind cleared, and he finally took a proper look around his accidental sanctuary. The cabin was oddly built. Unlike the crude, utilitarian structures erected by transient loggers, this place possessed elements of deliberate, expensive craftsmanship. The oak table was solid and heavy. The floorboards, though dusty, were made of wide plank mahogany, an absurdly expensive choice for a remote wilderness shack. Driven by a need to find anything useful, perhaps canned food or tools, Theodore began to search the premises. He pulled open the drawers of a small dresser. Empty. He checked the rafters. Nothing but cobwebs. It was only when he walked toward the corner of the room to inspect a tall wooden wardrobe that he noticed it. Thump. The sound of his boot hitting a specific floorboard didn't echo with the solid thud of wood over earth. It rang with a distinct, hollow resonance. A void. Theodore froze. He stepped back and tapped the board again. Thump. Thump. He knelt, brushing away decades of accumulated dust and pine needles. The mahogany planks here were perfectly fitted, but upon closer inspection, Theodore spotted the faintest outline of a seam. There were no nails holding this specific 2-foot section of wood in place. Using the heavy iron fire poker from the stove, Theodore wedged the flattened tip into the nearly invisible crack. He pushed down with all his remaining strength. The The wood groaned, resisted, and then, with a sharp crack, popped upward. He tossed the board aside. Beneath the floor, resting in a meticulously constructed, lead-lined cavity, sat a heavy, military-grade steel lockbox. The vault beneath the floor. Theodore's heart hammered against his ribs. The box was immaculate, devoid of the rust that plagued the rest of the cabin, protected by the lead lining. A heavy-duty brass master lock secured the front latch. Adrenaline overpowering his exhaustion, Theodore brought the heavy fire iron down onto the brass lock. Sparks flew. The metal dented, but held. He struck it again and again, the rhythmic clanging echoing loudly in the silent cabin. On the seventh strike, the internal tumblers shattered. He pulled the ruined lock away and slowly opened the heavy steel lid. Theodore stared in absolute disbelief. He had expected old hunting gear, maybe a stash of antique silver coins, or perhaps just family heirlooms. Instead, he found a neatly organized archive of immense wealth and dangerous secrets. Inside the lockbox lay 3 vacuum-sealed bundles, packed tight with crisp, blue-tinted paper. Theodore recognized them from his early days taking finance courses. They were Series 1995 municipal bearer bonds, unregistered, untraceable, and entirely liquid. The denomination on the top note was $10,000. There were dozens of them. A tarnished brass key, heavy and ornate, stamped with the number 814 and a logo Theodore vaguely recognized, the crest of the First National Bank of Helena, an institution that had been bought out and rebranded in the early 2000s. A thick, leather-bound ledger. The cover was worn smooth from use. Theodore carefully lifted the ledger, his hands shaking. He opened to the first page. It was covered in cramped, meticulous handwriting. Property of Jonathan D. Carmichael. If this book is found, the contingency has failed, and they have likely killed me. Theodore gasped, the cold air suddenly feeling much sharper in his lungs. Jonathan D. Carmichael. The name triggered a distant memory. In the late 1990s, Carmichael had been the brilliant, reclusive chief financial officer of Summit Financial Group, a massive investment firm based out of Seattle. In the winter of 1998, just before a federal grand jury was set to indict the firm for a multi-million-dollar embezzlement and land theft scheme, Carmichael had vanished. The official story claimed he had drowned in a tragic boating accident on Puget Sound, his body lost to the deep. Yet here was his handwriting, dated almost a year after his supposed death. Theodore began to read, scanning the pages with growing horror and fascination. The ledger was a master key to a labyrinth of corporate corruption. It detailed offshore routing numbers, bribes paid to local politicians, and a complex web of shell companies. But it was the names that made Theodore's blood run cold. Carmichael had documented payouts to State Senator Robert Maxwell, securing lucrative zoning permits. He had detailed backroom deals with Arthur Langdon, a prominent real estate mogul who had practically bought up half of Montana. And then, near the back of the ledger, Theodore saw a name that made his breath catch in his throat. Crescent Valley Freight, Subsidiary Operations, Manager L. Crowley, Asset Liquidation and Covert Transport, his former employer, his former boss. Leonard Crowley wasn't just a toxic manager. He was a lower-level operative in a sprawling, decades-old criminal syndicate that Carmichael had mapped out in explicit detail. The discrepancies Theodore had found in the shipping manifests, the very reason he had been fired and driven to homelessness, were the modern-day continuation of this exact criminal enterprise. He hadn't just stumbled upon an accounting error. He had accidentally peeked behind the curtain of a billion-dollar ghost network. The modern intruder. Theodore sat back, his mind reeling. The bearer bonds alone were worth enough to buy his life back 10 times over. The ledger was enough to bring down some of the most powerful men in the Pacific Northwest, bringing justice to the men who had ruined him. He was rich. He was vindicated. He reached into the back of the box to pull out the remaining bonds, but his fingers brushed against something else. Something that didn't belong. It was tucked neatly against the steel wall of the box. Theodore pulled it out and held it up to the sliver of sunlight. It was a piece of standard 8.5 by 11 printer paper. It wasn't yellowed or brittle like the pages of the ledger. It was crisp, white. Theodore unfolded it. It was an email printout. To Field Team Alpha. From Control. Date December 2nd, 2026. Subject: the Carmichael asset. Recent wire intercepts suggest the Helena deposit box was accessed by an unauthorized proxy. The primary ledger must still be at the fallback location in the Bitterroots. Coordinates attached. Retrieve the lockbox. Burn the cabin. Leave no trace. Theodore stared at the date. December 2nd, 2026. 2 weeks ago. The cabin hadn't been abandoned. The syndicate knew about it. They were looking for it. Before Theodore could fully process the reality of the paper in his hands, a sound broke the pristine, post-blizzard silence of the forest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the shifting of snow on the pine branches. It was the heavy, rhythmic crunch of snow tires crawling slowly up the hidden access road. Theodore scrambled to his feet, clutching the ledger to his chest. He backed away from the window just as the shadow of a large, dark SUV rolled to a halt in the clearing outside. A heavy car door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the frozen woods. Footsteps began to crunch through the deep snow, walking deliberately toward the front porch. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of snow boots on the wooden porch paralyzed Theodore. There were at least 2 of them, their footfalls synchronized and purposeful. They didn't sound like lost hikers seeking shelter. They sounded like men executing a tactical sweep. Theodore looked wildly around the single-room cabin. The only exit was the front door, currently blocked by the approaching men. The single window was heavily boarded, and prying the planks loose would make a deafening racket. Panic clawed at his throat, but the freezing temperatures of the past 24 hours had instilled a bizarre survivalist clarity in his mind. He looked up. Above the heavy oak table, the cabin's ceiling was open to the A-frame roof, crisscrossed by thick, rough-hewn rafters, cloaked in decades of dense spiderwebs and shadows. With seconds to spare, Theodore shoved the ledger, the email printout, and the thick stacks of bearer bonds deep into the inner pockets of his canvas coat. He grabbed the ruined padlock and the heavy fire poker, tossing them into the open cavity beneath the floor to hide the immediate evidence of his break-in. The brass doorknob began to turn. Theodore scrambled onto the heavy oak table. From there, he reached up, his freezing fingers gripping the rough edge of a massive pine rafter. He pulled with every ounce of his remaining strength, his muscles screaming in protest. Just as the cabin door swung violently inward, hitting the wall with a resounding crack, Theodore swung his legs up and rolled flat against the top of the wooden beam, disappearing into the pitch-black canopy of the roof. He held his breath, pressing his face against the dusty wood. 2 men stepped into the cabin. Even from his vantage point, 15 feet above, Theodore could feel the dangerous shift in the room's energy. They were dressed in high-end tactical winter gear, snow camouflage parkas, insulated ballistic pants, and dark goggles resting on their foreheads. The lead man, a tall, broad-shouldered enforcer with a pale, scarred jawline, immediately drew a suppressed semi-automatic pistol from his chest holster. "Fire's warm," the second man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He kicked the shattered remnants of the wooden chair near the stove. "Someone was just here." The tall man didn't reply. He moved with terrifying efficiency, his weapon raised as he swept the corners of the room. His boots made soft, deliberate sounds on the mahogany floorboards. Then he stopped, right over the corner where the floorboard had been pried up. "Elias," the tall man called out, his tone deadpan. "We have a problem." Elias rushed over, looking down at the exposed, lead-lined cavity. He cursed vividly. "The Carmichael box, it's gone. How the hell did a scavenger find a hidden seam that's been sealed for 28 years? "He didn't just find it," the tall enforcer replied, kneeling to inspect the splintered wood where Theodore had used the poker. "He broke the lock, and unless he evaporated through the walls, he hasn't gone far." The tall man slowly stood up. In the silence of the cabin, the only sound was the crackle of the dying embers and the faint, terrified wheeze of Theodore's breathing. The enforcer's head tilted slightly. He was listening. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his suppressed pistol, pointing it directly upward into the dark rafters. "Come down," the man ordered, his voice echoing in the small space. "Or I start putting rounds through the ceiling until gravity does the work for you." Theodore's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had no weapons. He was vastly outnumbered. But as he looked down, he noticed the angle of the tall man's stance. He was standing directly beneath the heavy, iron-wrought chandelier that hung by a rusted, fraying chain in the center of the room. Theodore didn't think. He acted. Reaching out with his heavy winter boot, Theodore delivered a vicious, downward kick to the ancient iron hook securing the chandelier to the rafter. With a metallic screech that tore through the cabin, the heavy iron fixture snapped free. It plummeted downward, carrying 40 pounds of rusted metal directly onto the tall enforcer. The man shouted in surprise as the iron crashed into his shoulder, sending his pistol clattering across the mahogany floorboards. "Hey!" Elias yelled, diving out of the way. Theodore didn't wait to see the aftermath. He dropped from the rafter, landing hard on the mattress in the corner of the room. The rusted bed frame collapsed under his weight with a deafening crunch. He scrambled to his feet, a burst of pure adrenaline masking the pain in his knees, and threw his entire body weight against the heavy oak door. He burst out into the blinding white of the afternoon sun, the freezing air hitting his lungs like shattered glass. Behind him, Elias fired. Thwip! Thwip! 2 suppressed rounds tore through the wooden doorframe, one of them close enough to slice a clean line through the fabric of Theodore's coat sleeve. Theodore dove off the porch and rolled into the deep snow. The enforcer's black SUV was idling in the clearing, exhaust billowing into the frigid air. Theodore knew he couldn't outrun a bullet, nor could he survive another night in the wilderness. He needed to cripple their pursuit. As he scrambled past the rear of the SUV, he noticed the vehicle's heavy-duty snow chains strapped to the tires. Acting on pure instinct, Theodore grabbed the loose end of the chain on the rear passenger tire and wrapped it violently around the vehicle's rear axle, looping it through the suspension coil and hooking it tight. It took exactly 3 seconds. "Get him!" Elias screamed from the porch. Theodore bolted into the dense, snow-laden tree line just as Elias rounded the vehicle. Bullets kicked up geysers of snow at Theodore's heels, but the thick trunks of the ancient pines provided heavy cover. He heard the enforcers pile into the SUV, heard the engine roar as they threw it into gear to give chase. And then he heard the glorious, violent sound of catastrophic mechanical failure. As the SUV accelerated, the improvised chain lock violently seized the rear axle. The tension ripped the suspension coil from its mount, shredding the tire and tearing the drive shaft loose with a deafening metallic crunch. The SUV spun wildly out of control and slammed head-on into a massive boulder hidden beneath a snowdrift. The horn blared continuously, echoing through the desolate mountains. Theodore didn't stop to admire his handiwork. He clutched the ledger tight to his chest and ran deeper into the bitterroots, guided only by the distant, faint sound of highway traffic. It took Theodore 6 agonizing hours to navigate the brutal terrain back to civilization. Frostbite had begun to claim the very tips of his fingers, and his vision was blurring by the time he collapsed onto the shoulder of Highway 12. He was found 20 minutes later by a county snowplow driver named Harrison Cole. When Harrison pulled his massive rig over, he expected to find a frozen corpse. Instead, he found Theodore Barnes, clutching a leather-bound book as if it were oxygen itself. "Don't take me to the local police," Theodore gasped, coughing violently as Harrison hauled him into the heated cab of the plow. "They own the police. Get me to a federal building. Spokane, please." Harrison, a veteran who possessed a healthy distrust of local bureaucracy, took one look at the bullet hole in Theodore's sleeve and nodded. He turned the plow around and drove 3 hours straight across the Washington border, directly to the FBI field office in Spokane. The ensuing 48 hours were a blur of intense interrogations, medical examinations, and federal protective custody. Theodore was placed in a secure hotel room, guarded by 2 armed agents, while he surrendered the ledger, the email, and the bearer bonds to Special Agent Bradley Whitmore, a seasoned financial crimes investigator who looked at the Carmichael ledger like it was the Holy Grail. "I've been hunting the Summit Financial Ghost Network for 15 years, Whitmore told Theodore, sitting across from him in the safe house. "Carmichael was their architect. When he vanished in '98, all the money vanished with him. We always assumed he was dead, taking the secrets to the bottom of the ocean." "He was," Theodore said, sipping hot coffee, the feeling finally returning to his hands. "But he built a dead man's switch, a contingency plan. That cabin was his insurance policy. And you found it." Whitmore smiled grimly. "Mr. Barnes, the information in this ledger doesn't just implicate Crescent Valley Freight. It maps out a $50 million money laundering pipeline that funnels straight to State Senator Robert Maxwell and real estate mogul Arthur Langdon, and your former boss, Leonard Crowley. He's the current logistics director for the entire Northwest operation." "Take them down," Theodore said, his voice quiet but hardened by the ice he had survived. "All of them." 2 days before Christmas, the federal hammer fell. It was a synchronized multi-state raid. In Missoula, FBI tactical teams breached the doors of Crescent Valley Freight before sunrise. Leonard Crowley was arrested in his pajamas, his arrogant sneer vanishing as federal agents tore apart his office, seizing hard drives that perfectly matched the accounts listed in Carmichael's ancient ledger. In Helena, Senator Maxwell was escorted out of a holiday charity gala in handcuffs, the news cameras capturing his stunning fall from grace. Arthur Langdon's assets were frozen globally within the hour. The syndicate, which had operated in the shadows for nearly 3 decades, was entirely dismantled in a single morning. The enforcers from the woods, Elias and the tall man, were apprehended at a rural clinic trying to treat a severely dislocated shoulder, sealing the federal conspiracy charges. As for Theodore Barnes, the government didn't just offer him a simple "thank you." Because the bearer bonds were unregistered and technically recovered as abandoned criminal assets, Theodore's legal counsel negotiated a substantial whistleblower bounty under the Federal Asset Forfeiture Program. He was awarded a percentage of the recovered funds, a sum that comfortably eclipsed $3 million. On Christmas Eve, Theodore stood on the porch of a beautiful, modest ranch house he had just purchased outright on the outskirts of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The medical debt that had haunted him since his wife's passing was paid in full. His cousin, Samuel Hayes, who had come to celebrate the holiday, was inside tending to a massive prime rib roasting in the oven. Theodore leaned against the wooden railing, holding a mug of hot cider, and looked out over the snow-covered pines in his backyard. The winter wind howled through the trees, a sound that just days ago had promised him a slow, agonizing death. Now it sounded like a symphony. He had lost everything: his job, his home, his dignity. He had been pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance, left to freeze in the forgotten corners of the world. But the wilderness hadn't claimed him. Instead, it had handed him a weapon. Theodore Barnes took a deep breath of the crisp, pine-scented air. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was alive. And for the first time in a very long time, he was looking forward to the new year. Theodore's journey from a freezing, homeless outcast to the man who dismantled a billionaire syndicate proves that the greatest gifts aren't under a tree. They are the second chances we fight for. What would you have done with the ledger and the millions in bonds? Let us know in the comments below. If you loved this incredible tale of survival and justice, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell so you never miss our next true-to-life thriller.